Well, I have the opportunity, the privilege to share with you today the message, and I had to lead off with, this has been like a bizarre time, hasn't it? A little strange. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting tired of hearing that. But interesting, I don't know if is a word to describe it, but it's something that I think has been placed on my heart to share with you all today is actually closer to maybe an emotional journey, right? This has been very emotional, and we've done a lot of really good things as far as, keep stepping forward, keep doing the things we need to do, and I'm trying to speak to everybody here. You know, some have had to shut in, and some have still had to go out to work, but I don't know how much time we've spent investing in the emotional journey. And this last week, the last couple of weeks, I've been recalling a lot of other emotional journeys. I don't know about you. That we've all had them, and the one that is coming up on the back of my mind more often than not happened several years ago. I was still a kid, in fact, and I remember. I think it was a Tuesday morning. I think, and the other thing I remember was kind of waking up to a strange, like a lot more lights were on in the morning. It was really early, I remember. And my mother was crying on the bed. My dad was packing a bag for all of us and trying to console her in between things. And I was just kind of confused. Next thing I know, she was on the phone with her school. She taught in the neighboring town. We were kind of like in a Hershey-Sutherland situation. My mom was teaching at Hershey, but we were in like Sutherland, but down in Kansas. So, and then she was talking to Miss Penalto, my teacher, and I thought, what is going on here? And they finally sat me down and told me, Micah, Papa passed away. I was in the second grade. I didn't fully understand the gravity of that. I knew it was sad. I knew it wasn't right, but my mind almost couldn't wrap around it. Just like I think many of us can't fully grasp or wrap our minds around this enduring COVID situation or racial crisis. It just keeps perpetuating, and it's like, what are the questions? And I keep reflecting on this, and I knew it wasn't good then. And to contextualize just a little bit more, my grandfather lived in the panhandle of Oklahoma. We were pretty close to Oklahoma. In fact, it was just about a 2-hour drive to little old Strait, Oklahoma. That's what the name of the town was called. He actually lived in the parsonage of the church there. So it was so small, they even rented out the parsonage for just your average person. And we were down there all the time. My grandfather, my papa, and my mom played a lot of music together, okay? I think that's where it came from. Excuse me. And in fact, the year before, about every week, he came up and took me to Tiger Scouts because I was too afraid to go on my own. So we were on this drive all the time, and there was this long stretch of road, and you know it because whenever you drive across the state line, there's kind of this, whether it's Kansas to Nebraska or to Oklahoma, there's kind of this road correction on the state highways where you have to jog back one way or the other. Well, I got to tell you, I think it's 83, but if you go on 83 through the Panhandle, there's like a really long quarter-mile jog west type of thing, and it's all curve. So if you slow way down, and then you go through it, you can accelerate through and like pull everybody in the car sideways, right? And then you got to go back the other way so you can throw them back to the other side of the car. And my dad did that all the time. It was just one of the joys of going to see my grandparents. And I remember that morning, my dad didn't accelerate through it. That long curve felt even longer. And there was no pull, there wasn't the joy, and I was kind of confused. Something was wrong, but I didn't know how to articulate it. And in many ways, the oceans of emotions that we have experienced in the last few months are kind of the same way, aren't they? There's a loss of a loved one that never really subsides, I still miss them here. And if we're honest about ourselves in our current situation, we're not very good about handling our emotions, are we? At least culturally, I'll say. And I would argue that often we let our emotions dictate the who, what, when, where, and why, and how of what we do instead of recognizing Christ gives us a choice to act in spite of our emotions. Not that they go away, but we can act. He gives us that incredible power, right? Jesus, and just to give him the glory and to recognize the type of power he is, I love this translation, the Message translation of 1 John 1:14. He became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. He saw the glory with We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. I think he is the one we need to keep our eyes on in the midst of this storm. I love that. He moved into the neighborhood. Jesus, in his one-of-a-kind glory, offers us something practical when it comes to facing these storms. If you think about literal bodies of water, whether they're oceans or seas or just going out to Lake Mac or anything like that, there's a reason why we fear these bodies of water, aren't they? It comes down to that one word, drowning, right? I happen to know a little bit about it because I might have spent 10 years working at a pool. And we did a lot of training around this concept of how do we recognize drowning and that kind of thing. And Hollywood doesn't do us any favors. You know why? Because Hollywood makes it, help, I'm drowning, that kind of, it never happens that way, at least in all my years of experience. Now, I never saw anybody drown, but as they entered that state, they never called out. And it was so fast. It wasn't this long, drawn-out thing. It always happened really quick. That's why, at least when I was managing lifeguards, I hate to say it, I was a little bit of a jerk because you have to watch. The signs, if you're not watching, you'll miss them. No, we never had a major injury or drowning in all the years, and I accredit that to the amazing individuals who trained me and that I got to work with. But we would watch for these things because, again, people wouldn't scream when they were going under. They're too busy grasping for air is what they're doing. Literally, just grasping for air. That's what they're trying to do. Even, all right, I'll tell you about this one guy. I'm not going to share his name because I don't know if he's watching, but he was a 275-pound college linebacker, okay? So he was on the wrestling team too. So just this big guy, I had to look up to his shoulders. I thought he was going to eat me. And he just, so athletic. It was incredible to me because he comes into the pool this day and he says, "Hey, Micah, how you doing?" And I said, "Dude, you can't swim. What are you doing here?" Like, we knew this. I knew this about him. And he said, "Oh, don't worry, I got this." And he goes over to the diving boards. And I'm like, "What are you doing?" Yeah. And so he was athletic enough. He would take this big, deep breath of water, jump off the diving board, let himself sink all the way to the bottom, and then jump as hard as he could up toward the side. And he did it, to my surprise. I mean, I was standing there with like 4 inner tubes ready to like jump in, like. But even he, not recognizing that his strength was tired from football practice that morning, didn't quite make it one time. And I did have to get in for him. And he did exactly like the 3-year-old girl or the others that I had seen go into that condition. Just start reaching for anything and grasping for air. He didn't even call out for help in all of his physical might. I bring this up as an analogy for our emotional situations today because when we are emotionally driven, think about it. We just grasp for air. We just make the next choice instead of thinking about what is the wholesome choice, what is the best choice. We often don't recognize it, and instead of doing the things we need to do, we just keep grasping for straws, grasping for air. We push through to the brink of destruction. And we lead and we wonder why we have failed marriages, failed friendships, failure to hold down a job. These are all the results of not addressing this spiritual thing of emotion. And it's a physical thing too. Have any of you ever heard of emotional intelligence? Have you heard of that thing? It's kind of this thing that's contrary to IQ, just actual measures of intelligence that way, but this is kind of a different thing. And there's a book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0 where authors Bradbury and Greaves explain that each and every one of us has this battle every day, and here's why. It's a physical manifestation. This is their quote. "The daily challenge of dealing effectively with emotions is critical to the human condition because our brains are hardwired to give the emotions the upper hand." Now, I could read for you the whole chapter, but I'll explain it real quickly this way. Things, your senses absorb into your spine through electrical signals up the back of your head and hopefully make it to your frontal lobe, which is where reason is processed. But there's this thing in the middle called the limbic system. Now, it doesn't matter that you know what any of this is. It just means that the limbic system is the emotional center and everything we absorb or experience has to go through this emotionally before it goes through logically. And we could go through the psychology of it. We could go through we could spend a lot of time on that, but really I think this is a spiritual thing. And why not look to Jesus, who had the same physical manifestations, had the same type of situation that we have to deal with? Who, as Paul describes in Philippians 4:7, demonstrated the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, and who will guard our hearts and our minds. How would Jesus have dealt with the loss of his papa, or a loved one, or a family member? How would Jesus have dealt with emotional crisis today? And you remember, Maya, you read so well, our text began this way in verse 13 of Matthew 14. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. To contextualize this, Jesus had just heard about his cousin John dying, right? In Matthew 14 verse 10, so John was beheaded in prison. And you can read all about this gruesome death, this unfair, untimely death, but even more so, it describes the wicked women that made it happen, right? He knew the who, he knew why, he knew everything about it. If I were Jesus, I'll be honest with y'all, I'd have done the lightning thing. You guys ever think about the lightning thing? Or the pillars of fire in the Old Testament? Man, he could just send one down on the whole city, right? But I'm not Jesus. And Jesus does a couple of practical things that is contrary to what we do in these crises. And the very first thing he does is he steps back. In Matthew 14:13, it says, he, Jesus, withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. So he hears the news, and then he pulls back with the disciples. He takes a step back. His initial reaction was to get alone with his thoughts and to pray. Personally, I find it helpful to go take a drive. You guys ever do that? I just need to maybe go once around the lake. For those of you that aren't at the lake, maybe you just go around town once. I don't know. But you do something like that. The other thing I really like to do if I'm taking a real step back is I actually play the blues, okay? How many saxophone players do we got out here? No? Okay, that's all right. Isaac will understand. You get it, right? There's something about music anyway. There's something about thoughtful reflection. And when you play the blues, it's not about distracting yourself. It's not about just playing the next fun lick. It's actually about thoughtfully and mindfully thinking through your emotion. It really is. B.B. King, the famous jazz guitarist, said it this way: blues is a tonic for whatever ails you. I could play the blues and then not be blue anymore. While God has given us the divine gift of music, he's also given this ability to step back and to reflect, to take a deep breath, if that's all we have for just a moment, to recognize the suffering, to recognize the pain, whatever it is, the emotion. And it's good. Instead of straying away from it, we can recognize it for a moment. And then the very next thing Jesus does, and I think this is really cool. Continuing in verse 13, the crowds heard where he was headed, Jesus, and followed him on foot from many towns. So, the sad reality is most people don't care what you're going through emotionally, do they? They want you to perform. They want you to keep going. There's still the chores that need to be done. The baby still needs fed. And as the crowds catch up to Jesus, the disciples recognize that, oh man, Jesus was just trying to get away. Did you hear the news? They're probably devastated themselves. They knew John. And instead of doing what I would have done, and throw a pity party for myself and begrudgingly just went on ahead and made it through the day, he goes overboard. And he shuts them down. He said, that isn't necessary. You feed them. I think that's so cool. Matthew 14:16. That isn't necessary. You feed them. After stepping back, Jesus leans into his responsibilities. He takes that deep breath, and instead of just kind of floating out there, he runs right into serving. Like yours and minds, your and mine, he's probably swimming for a means of escape, but he does the opposite of what he feels like he should do. Let's go back to this lifeguarding analogy for a second. There's one thing I was trained to do that fortunately I never had to practice, and that was dealing with somebody who got to that extreme point of drowning. See, there's a moment that's even more terrifying of just grasping for air and about to go under. It's when somebody gets so combative that they'll attack or grab onto anything. They go vertical in the water and they're splashing, and they'll even grab loved ones just to push up on for that last breath of air. And it's really scary because the lifeguard still has to rescue, still have to go in there. There's still responsibility to do. And instead of backing away or trying to fight them, like, throwing an elbow or punching them or something, why would you do that? That's terrible for Hollywood. But instead of doing that, you still just rush in. You try to help. And when they push down on you, because they will, if they're at that point, you only have one option left. Can you guess what it is? You take your last breath and you go down as deep as you possibly can in the water. You surrender to the situation. You surrender to Jesus and pray for help. It's there you can create some more space. You can get away from the situation. You can get behind them, perform the rescue you need to. But the same could be said for us when we feel like we're drowning emotionally. When our frustration leaves us wanting to punch a hole in the wall, it's at that point we need to surrender the most. Dive deep into the love of Jesus and show compassion, not confrontation, not ignorance or indifference, but compassion. Jesus, even though he himself was facing an ugly emotional situation, he calmly helps. He performs his divine and priestly duty, and then he feeds 5,000 men, not including women and children. What an amazing miracle. Verse 14 of Matthew 14, he had compassion on them. Oftentimes, like drowning victims, we're too focused on the situation and too focused on how to make it better that we forget we're supposed to keep our eyes above the waves and look for help. Look to Jesus. Act as he did with compassion. So again, there's kind of two things here that I'm pulling from this text. As Jesus is going through emotional crisis, we step back, we take that breath, we rush in to show compassion, and then this point is probably the most important. In verse 22 and 23, Jesus immediately after this insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. So everybody's going. He's sending them all away. After sending them home, he went up to the hills. This is the most important part. By himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. It's in those silent and quiet moments of reflection, of intimacy with God in prayer, that we can hear his calling. We can hear his presence. We can hear his hope. There's something amazing. This wasn't in my notes, but I spent a lot of time at the deep end of the pool. And there's something amazing when the water is totally crashed in, totally blocked out your hearing. It's almost as if you can actually hear that whisper, even if it's just for a moment. We don't always know what the mysteries of tomorrow will reveal. The trouble of the day may follow us into the night, but let's remember what Pastor Doug said at the beginning of worship in Psalm 30, verse 5. Joy comes in the morning. And after Jesus surrenders in prayer to our Father in heaven, yes, we've heard an amazing miracle about feeding 10,000 people, but this, I think, is the most amazing. Early in the morning, verse 25, Jesus, he came walking toward them on the sea. He walks on water. Is it a literal body or is it an emotional body of water? I want you to consider that and think that about his pain and frustration. Jesus shows us the way forward to take in the emotions, not to ignore them like the Stoics of antiquity, but to address them through service to one another. It's all possible because he has made the path, okay? We don't have a God who just stays up there and says, get over it. No, he joins us in our pain. And Paul describes this in Hebrews. I think this is so good. Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. That means he's able to walk on the water. And I hope today, as we kind of conclude here, that you don't hear any kind of emotional superiority or psychological trick. If that's what you've heard, I think you've missed it. But the difference between managing your emotions and truly surrendering them to Christ is that you get to experience the joy and the sorrow with Christ, which is even better. I still, to this day, we were driving yesterday, crossing the state line from Kansas to Nebraska. everybody was asleep, so I didn't accelerate too much. But I did a little bit through the curve. Just a little bit, just to honor my grandpa. Feel that joy, recite that. I still grieve his loss in some ways, but I choose to keep my eyes above the waves. And I love to imagine it this way. If our feelings can best be described as raging seas or even oceans of emotions, then it is Jesus who not leaves us there in the storm, but actually orders us out of the boat, away from our false sense of security and control, and at the same time makes it possible for us to walk on water too. Let's be in a spirit of prayer. Father in heaven, I just thank you for the opportunity to come to you, to lay our burdens down at your feet, to totally surrender to you, because that's what this is about. That's what our worship is about. That's what we gather for, is to hear this word of encouragement that you still conquer the evils of death. You still conquer all sorts of things. But Jesus, even more so, instead of just being a conqueror, you are a friend who is there to walk with us, to guide us, to show us how to manage every step of life's journey. And so today, Jesus, as a friend and as a confidant, we lean into you. We lean into your presence. And I pray that everyone who's heard this message, even myself, Jesus, would be able to lay a little bit more down at your feet, to process through it with you, and to help us make more wholesome choices, to abolish any kind of hatred in this world, but to bring your kingdom here. Jesus, thank you for this miracle to walk on water. Thank you for the hope and encouragement that you give us daily. Help us draw that in. We love you, we praise you, and we thank you. It's in your holy and blessed name we pray. Amen.